Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent, Holland. Welcome one and all to Night Fright. Settle in right away. Stop what you're doing. Sit on the comfy couch as always. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, or a beverage of your choice going. Tonight, counter-terrorism. Let me read this. Fans of the show will remember that several weeks ago we had on Colonel Robert Darling, and we did a whole show on 9/11, folks, and he was sitting in the White House bunker that day throughout the whole day and taking orders from Dick Cheney, Vice President Dick Cheney, and Secretary of, was she Defense or State at that time? I can't remember. Condoleezza Rice. And it's in the archives, www.nightfrightshow. But how did we get to 9/11 and the tragedy that took place that day? Our guest tonight will take us there. He is a counterterrorism expert and former U.S. diplomatic Secret Service agent, which is kind of like the Secret Service, except instead of guarding the president, they guard diplomats that come to U.S. soil. Case in point, folks, when Iran's Ahmadinejad came to speak at the UN recently, the DSS were tasked to protect him. Could you imagine that? Protecting that slime ball? How do you really feel about Ahmadinejad, Brent? Okay, we'll continue. But, you know, on the other end, folks, they're also tasked to protect the royal family. So that gives you a good basis of what the DSS does. And there's a lot of clandestine stuff that goes on there as well. In order to tell tonight's story with our guest tonight, Fred Burton, and his new book, Chasing Shadows, we have to have a starting place. And that starting place is Washington, 1973. When an Israeli Air Force attaché is murdered. Now, rumors are abound that this was no ordinary murder, that in fact, the man murdered, his name is Joe Allen, was indeed an undercover Mossad agent, and his murder was a desperate act to silence him for what he was about to reveal. Information, folks, that neither the Mossad, CIA, or FBI wanted to come out. Tonight, we go deep into counterterrorism with our guest Fred Burton. His new book, Chasing Shadows. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Welcome, welcome one and all. I'm Brent Holland. Welcome to Night Fright. Folks, tonight a new book called Chasing Shadows with our guest Fred Burton. Let me tell you an easy way to get the book. www.nightfrightshow.com. As always, folks, click on that book cover associated with tonight's guest. That'll take you right to a spot online where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home, and hopefully you've got your tea and coffee going, or beverage of your choice going. It's going to be a great journey, folks. It's going to be a real roller coaster ride. Strap in. Okay, click on the book cover associated with tonight's guest, and that'll take you right to a spot. Folks, this book will take you on a virtual roller coaster ride of espionage with one significant difference. It's all true. Fred, I want to welcome you to the show for the very first time. Most definitely not the last.
Thank you very much, Brent, for having me on.
Thank you, Fred. First off, I want to thank you for your service over all the years in keeping us safe.
Well, not so sure how good of a job I personally did, but we certainly tried for many, many years.
And indeed, you have succeeded. In your former book called Ghost, again, folks, I would urge you all to go to the www.nightfrightshow and just click on that book cover. Just a fascinating read as well. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Chasing Shadows. Now, the first question I had for you, I am actually going to ditch and ask you another question, because I think it's something I wanted to ask you, and it's very apropos. I had mentioned that the DSS is tasked to guard folks like Ahmadinejad. You had mentioned in Ghost you had to guard Arafat. It's one thing to be a Secret Service agent, and we had Abraham Bolden on the show, by the way, folks. His show is in the archives as well. He was the first African American Secret Service agent handpicked by JFK, and he said he would have taken that bullet had he been on duty in a heartbeat, without any question whatsoever. It's one thing to take a bullet for the President of the United States, someone that you may hold redeem, but it's another thing to be willing to take that bullet for a guy like Arafat, for a guy like Ahmadinejad. How did you get by that? For me, it would have been a major stumbling block.
Well, you have to look at the mission and the long history of the DSS. Currently, you can't turn on a news program without seeing the heroic efforts of our agents in Benghazi. That was part of our responsibilities, are the protection of diplomatic facilities overseas. Domestically, inside the continental United States, we perform a tremendous amount of protection for visiting crown princes and foreign ministers, and in essence, if you look over through the course of time, going back to 1916 is when our organization was actually created. And through the course of time, we protected folks like Fidel Castro, and into my era in the 80s and the 90s when we had Arafat. Historically, Brent, what happens is when the White House really doesn't know who to assign to protect to somebody, DSS typically gets that job. And at times it's a lot of fun. When we had the British royals, for example, Princess Diana and Prince Charles, and the kids at that time, William and Harry, who are now grown, but it was just a wonderful job to be a part of. And certainly, my prayers go out to the families of the ones affected in Benghazi, the SEALs that were killed, and of course Ambassador Stevens. And the politics of the job are always there. Historically, you can look at when I was hired was after the Beirut embassy bombings in 1983 and 1984, and we jumped from 200 agents around the world to about 750. And I was part of the initial wave that was hired and went right out of basic agent training into the counterterrorism division of the State Department. And we literally only had 3 agents in the unit. And I talk about that in my first book, Ghost.
That's right. Listen, Fred, for the folks that are just joining us that may not have been around in that era, could you just explain what Beirut was, 1983, and how the barracks blew up and what led to that?
In the early 80s, we had a terrorist organization by the name of Hezbollah, which means the Party of God. And they were closely aligned with Iran, and still are today, which is one of the more significant geopolitical events. But in the early 80s, Hezbollah decided that they were going to target and kill Westerners, predominantly Americans, and they created huge, horrific vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices and blew up the United States Embassy in Beirut in 1983. And then in 1984, they also attacked our embassy again, and they also bombed the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, as well as the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. And just these horrific Oklahoma City-style bombings long before the events of 9/11, certainly. So the organization that I was a part of was responsible for protecting these facilities and protecting American diplomats overseas.
Very good. Folks, our guest tonight is Fred Burton. His new book is called Chasing Shadows, Fabulous book, folks. It is a roller coaster of an espionage book, but with one significant difference, and this is going to be my repeating mantra tonight. It's a true story, folks. Everything in this book is true. You're going to want to get this book. Easy way to get it, as always, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And tonight's a great night to do that, folks. Just settle in, relax. We're going to take you on a true story of the behind-the-scenes espionage work and DSS work as well with our guest tonight, Fred Burton. Okay, Fred, what took place July 1st, 1973 that got you kind of an epiphany, I guess it was, that night for you, wasn't it, when the murder took place?
Well, in many ways it was. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and we had a good number of diplomatic kids in the neighborhood just because of the diplomatic community there in and around Washington. And one summer morning, we wake up to learn that there had been a murder in the neighborhood of a diplomat, and I did not know at the time that I'd actually was in high school with the murder victim's oldest daughter. I subsequently learned that as time would go on, but a man who many years later I would learn was the defense attaché assigned to the Israeli embassy. But his killing really kind of rocked our little world, like most of us when we grow up in the days before the internet and cell phones, and you don't expect these kinds of things to happen in your neighborhood. And lo and behold, if you fast forward about 37 years later, I would learn that the killer was tied to an act of international terrorism, which again is hard to fathom as looking back on my life as a 16-year-old when this occurred. So, but as you step back and you look in the time frame in America during that period in the 70s, there was a tremendous amount of turmoil in the United States. We had, Watergate had occurred. You had domestic unrest. You had radical extremist organizations, the Weather Underground.
Black Panthers.
The Black Panthers, certainly. You had tremendous espionage going on U.S. and Canadian soil. And you had a lot of cross-border activities with all these groups between the United States and Canada. And so it was just really a troubled time in America that most of us, at least living in that time period, you might have seen evening news with Walter Cronkite, or it was on the front page of the Washington Post when it was delivered in the morning. But other than that, you were kind of isolated from world events.
Very much so. And folks, let's not forget, in those days, if you were doing research in a university, there wasn't just going and doing a Google. You virtually had to do the research book by book by book, looking at indexes. It was time consuming and it was taxing. Also in that era, just prior to that, in the 60s, of course, 1963, we had the murder of JFK. 1968, Martin Luther King, and 4 months later, of course, Bobby Kennedy was gone. Those were three fellas of such revered stature. And to have those people swooped away from us in such a great... Well, look at Bobby Kennedy's. If Bobby Kennedy had lived, we would not have had Watergate. We would not have had Richard Nixon. Chances are he probably would have won the election. So that just shows you the profoundness of what an assassination can do to the course of history. Let's go back a little bit. I had mentioned the 60s, Fred. Can we talk about the War of 1967, the Six-Day War as it's become to know, and what led up to that, and why that was such a pivotal moment in the course of this book, Chasing Shadows, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover, and I'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I would be happy to. If you look back in this time period, it's a fascinating world events, and in many ways you can fast forward to today, and this is why it clearly still resonates today. As you look at the geopolitics of the world and Israel and the Palestinians and Iran and our long-standing support for Israel, which pretty much, as you step back in this period, which I try to discuss in Chasing Shadows, in that in '67 you had a very pivotal war in the Middle East with Israel fighting for its life, and my victim in Chasing Shadows was a heroic Israeli Air Force pilot, and one of the things that I'm very proud of, Brent, with my book, that was that I was able to get a Hebrew edition published, which surprised me, but the Israeli Air Force actually has my book, the Hebrew version, on their official website, which is just a very humbling experience for me. And in Israel, and I've spent my many years in meetings and discussions with the Israeli Defense Forces, the Shin Bet, and so forth. As you look at the Israelis, the fighter pilots within Israel are always deemed to be a cut above. I know there's a lot of interagency rivalries between all military services, but Israeli pilots are deemed to be the protectors of the state of Israel. And the victim in my book was a hero of the Israeli Air Force and literally one of their founders. And because of his prominence, and Israel's a very small country, and it was even smaller in '67, everybody knew each other. And you look through the time period as I was doing research for my book, and Colonel Joe Alon is rubbing elbows with Rabin and Perez and Moshe Dayan. I've got just great pictures of them all together, like some of the original founders of the state of Israel. So
it's he was indeed a hero. There's no question. And folks, the 1967 war, it was called the Six-Day War because once again Israel had a knife at its throat. Nothing new there. It still does to this day. The Arab countries had, I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version, the Arab countries had virtually surrounded and were set to pounce upon Israel and take them out. And as Fred alluded to, it's a very small country, folks. It's got the population of the whole province of Quebec in a country about the size of the island of Montreal, or PEI, if you will. So you can imagine that small little piece of territory is very, very difficult to defend, especially when right on your borders are people that just want to annihilate you like the Nazis did. So what the Israeli Air Force did was they preempted an attack on the Egyptian Air Force and took them out. There's a wonderful story in here, too, that it's called the War of Attrition, which took place after Israel won that 1967 war, or the Six-Day War. And during the War of Attrition, what happened was the Egyptians would cross the Israeli border and do all kinds of terrorist acts. Could you tell the story, because I love this story, Fred, where the two Mirage jets, I think they were Mirage jets, flew over Cairo, and what they did there? Do you remember that story in your book? They lit where they lit the rafter burners over Cairo.
Oh, they when they sent the shock waves and the afterburners.
Yeah, I love that story. Basically, what they did was just to show Nasser, who was the president, if you will, of Egypt at that time, that they could attack at any time. Instead of dropping bombs on Cairo, they flew over Cairo, lit their afterburners, called the shock waves. The shock waves blew out all kinds of windows, and Nasser was just pissed off. So there we have it. Fred, let's go back to your book. Now, what was the next step in your investigation of this horrific murder that took place right on U.S. soil? Now, that's pretty ballsy, if you will, for terrorists to come right on U.S. soil and feel confident enough to get away with it. This is
Yeah,
1973.
there were several amazing aspects as I look back on this case. Well, if you fast forward, Brent, I became a local police officer in the county where this murder occurred. And I would drive by the house in the neighborhood on midnights on my way home, for example, and think about how the killers got away and where did they go. And then I was fortunate enough to be hired as a special agent with the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service and assigned to this counterterrorism division. So I was able to formally open the investigation again and take a look at it initially, which I tried to do. But we were so overwhelmed with terrorist attacks in the 80s that there was not a lot of interest in looking at cold cases like this one that had occurred. And so I did what I could in after hours. But there's certain events here that are just remarkable to me that I'd like to share. For example,
Yes, sir.
The day after the murder, Henry Kissinger himself and Richard Nixon authorized the use of Air Force Two to fly Colonel Holland back to Israel. And you spoke briefly about the JFK murder. The only other time I was able to research any use of Air Force Two was when they brought Kennedy's body back from Dallas to Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And to the best of my knowledge, Air Force Two has never been used before again, other than to fly Colonel Holland's body back to Israel in that kind of case. So we had an unprecedented case of them flying the body home during that time period aboard Air Force Two. And the FBI during that time period just wasn't equipped to deal with this kind of investigation, and nor was the local police. This is before DNA. This is before your CSI kind of crime scenes. Mm-hmm. So it was very, very difficult to get it to collect evidence. Nothing like we have today. If you had an attack that takes place in Canada or the United States, you have very remarkable, well-oiled machines that investigate these cases, and that just didn't occur. And in the course of my investigation, I found out that many years later, all the forensic evidence surrounding this case had been destroyed, which was an amazing tripwire for me in the case, because I had the assistance of an old school detective that had the case, one of the old timers. And then I reached out and found the original FBI case agent, a man by the name of Stan Ornstein, who was extraordinarily helpful. So the three of us kind of worked together to look at the case and try to figure out who killed Colonel Holland in 1973. But we were pushing a boulder up a hill in that the evidence had been destroyed. Many of the persons involved in the initial investigation had died. You had missing case files, so it became very kind of problematic. And I also, Brent, was very blessed to have the Holland family. Colonel Holland, when he was gunned down on the front lawn of his house, again in my neighborhood, as you can imagine, he comes home late at night, pulls in the driveway. His wife gets out, goes in. She hears gunshots. She looks, she cuts off the porch light. She rushes out, and Colonel Holland is literally dying on the front lawn of their house. And two of the three little girls run out and literally watch their father die. And it's the kind of event that none of us would ever want to witness. And the next day, the family is put aboard Air Force Two and flown out of the country. So if you fast forward many years later, the daughters actually reached out to me once they heard that I was looking into this case, and were extraordinarily helpful. And I couldn't have accomplished what I did without their help. And unbeknownst to me, they had made a personal crusade to try to get the Israeli government to investigate this case, because they really wanted to know what happened to their dad. Like most kids, there was a vacuum there that would never be filled. And The mom went to her grave not knowing what happened. I'm afraid I couldn't get to the bottom of it in time. But I think I gave the daughters a sense of closure by figuring out who did it and figuring out why. But as a father of girls myself, that scene, I just became fixated on that scene, Brent, of them rushing out and watching their father die. And that really kept me going through the years of looking at this case, when it seemed that we were at times not having any luck or any leads whatsoever.
When you first witnessed the body, was Joe still alive at that point, or had he passed away?
Joe was transported after the shooting to a hospital very close to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where President Kennedy's body was flown back to, by the way. But he more than likely died on the lawn, based on the forensics of the rounds that were fired out of the darkness of night. One pierced his heart, and he pretty much bled out. There was not a lot that could have been done, even in today's modern trauma sciences, I'm afraid. The more and more I probed into who Colonel Holland was, it was like peeling an onion back and stepping back into
layer after layer
of the politics and the espionage, and you know, our country is very close to your country. You know, the U.S. and the U.K. and the Canadians and the Australians pretty much share everything together, but Israel has a love-hate intelligence relationship with the U.S. entities and our allied partners like the U.K. and Canada. And there's one thing you learn in this business as an agent, Brent. There are no friendly intelligence services.
I'm surprised to hear that.
So I've had this discussion for hours with the family of Colonel Holland, who tried desperately to get some answers from the Israeli government on the case. Remember, part of the duties of a defense attaché, in essence, is liaison, but some would call that espionage as well, meaning he is here in the country to try to get information, try to meet people, try to develop intelligence. And Israel has so many enemies and fought so many battles and wars that when Colonel Holland was gunned down that night, the Israeli government just simply moved on. And I understand that. They have many enemies and they're fighting many wars. But I do think, in looking back at the case, that a lot more could have been done. And I blame myself too. When I started as an agent in the 80s, I should have made a better effort in that time period to look at this case when you had a lot more people that were alive connected to it. So there's a lot of guilt with this case all around, and guilt's a powerful motivator, Brent, and it certainly also, I think, at times drove me to try to do the right thing with this case.
Do you feel you assumed responsibility over the years somehow to solve this case, like that it was always your ultimate goal, perhaps even the reason for getting in the DSS?
I think the killing was the reason I chose a path in law enforcement and ultimately decided to go down the path that I did. But I also came to the conclusion that if I didn't solve this case, try to solve this case with the wonderful help of Detective Ed Golian from the police department and the retired FBI agent, that nobody would. And the reason for it is just that too many other killings since 1973. If you step back in this time period, this is after the horrific events, 1972 Munich massacre. September organization came in and killed the 11 Olympic athletes from the state of Israel. And Israel and the Palestinians were in a tit-for-tat covert war of killing each other around the globe. And Colonel Alon is roped into this as well. So we've just had so many killings over the years that from a cold case perspective, there's really not a lot of time and attention paid to cold cases in the counterterrorism arena, simply because you're worried about the next kind of Benghazi attack.
That's right. Folks, our guest tonight, Fred Burton, you're going to love this book, folks. It is called Chasing Shadows. All the subject matter we're talking about tonight is instilled in this book. Folks, this is a story that is full of espionage, as Fred alluded to. It is also the true story of, I would say, Fred trying to find closure for his own self. And we're going to go into that a little bit, too. What drives Fred to be in this? I mean, this is not... Most people growing up want to be a fireman, a policeman, sure, but going into the clandestine services, I would say, is not something that most people really entertain as they're going through university, going through high school, college, whatever. But this is definitely a service where you can do great service to your country, without question. The book is called Chasing Shadows, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. That's going to take you right to a spot where you can order this book from the comfort of your own home. And as I said before, it is a true story. Fred, do you feel that the clandestine services, for the younger folks that are listening right now, is a service that you can actually make a difference in keeping the country safe?
Very much so. I think I look back over my career. I was fortunate enough to become a special agent with the State Department, and it was amazing to me at times, some of the things that we were involved in. The training is just simply fabulous. You get to travel the world. You have a black diplomatic passport. You live overseas at times. It's not like what you see in the movies, but at times it certainly can be. It's also a very surreal experience, Brent. And the reason I say that is I've been doing a lot of interviews on the Benghazi tragedy, and that was our agents out there tasked to protect the ambassador. And you can think of that kind of event, and I can't tell you how many similar occurrences over the years the State Department special agents have been confronted with in very similar circumstances. And you're always doing more with less. You never have the resources that you need. And then even in my day, much like in the book, you look around and we all like to think that there's someone out there that is doing something about these kinds of problems. But then you look around and at the end of the day and you realize that nobody is, and that's your responsibility. And I think that for young university kids looking to get into a business, there's no more noble service than to try to join organizations like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or the Canadian Intelligence Service of CSIS. Both of them are tremendous organizations with an extraordinary amount of opportunities, much like the organization that I came from. And it's at times gut-wrenching. It's at times extremely frustrating, but there's also a sense of responsibility and duty that you really can't get in doing much else. And I would look around at times and say, well, if I don't do this, who's going to? And that kind of drove me too. I was fortunate enough to have participated in the capture of Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing.
1993, folks, by the way.
The first time the Trade Towers was attacked. Right. And I realized when when we did that, that if we did not act and act quickly, that this master terrorist would get away. And I've been given much more credit than I deserve for my part that I played in that. We had some very heroic agents that risked their life, and it worked out well. It could have gone bad in retrospect, but at the end of the day, I think you can make a difference by getting in this line of work, and there's no shortage for the need, as you can see with our problems in Benghazi and the Iran nuclear problems, and the same events that Colonel Holland was dealing with, which resulted in his killing in 1973, are the exact same events that we're confronted with today in modern times. And it's important for people to get involved and to get in this business, I feel.
I agreed wholeheartedly. Fred Burton's our guest tonight, folks. Chasing Shadows is the book, www.knifewriteshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Fred Burton. He's a counter-terrorist expert. He was also a member of the DSI, which is the Diplomatic Secret Service, which is similar to the Secret Service that guards the president. The difference being, for example, when Prince Charles comes to the United States, they're tasked along with Prince Charles's security services to watch the prince, make sure everything's okay. On the other end of that, when somebody like Ahmadinejad comes, they have to guard him too. So that's what the DSS does, and Fred spent his life in keeping both countries, I would say, because both countries, folks, I've never considered Americans just neighbors. They're family. Let's face it, we are. As JFK once said in the House of Commons, let nobody disrupt what God has brought together. And let's face it, we're families. Some went north, some stayed south when the American independence movement went through in 1776. And in the same sense that I look at my family, although I would never want to live with my brother and sister, and I love you guys, nobody comes to them but through me. And I think most Canadians feel that way, and I'm sure most Americans in reverse feel the same way. We're family. We're that tight. Much different relationship, folks, than any other relationship around the world. Guaranteed. I think together we show that countries can not only just live together, but actually enjoy a certain ambiance, a certain freedom where we are like family. It's just an incredible, I think we're an example to the world. I really do. Okay, let's go back to Fred. Fred, I want to touch on something that I've been looking at your photo now. Just over your left hand shoulder, there's a flag that's folded. Can you tell the story behind that flag? If you don't want to, that's fine.
Oh, I'd be more than happy to. That's actually right by a plaque that I have from former President Bush and former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Was kind enough to send me an autographed picture after he read one of my books. The flag was given to me by a U.S. Army trauma doctor who was deployed to the front lines of Afghanistan to save Marines on the battlefield. And he also had read my books and just was kind enough to ship me that flag, which I feel very honored to have. I look at the work that he did to save lives and think of the job that I did was nothing like his, but it was very humbling to receive that. So people send me things like that, which I just put around the office. I also have a big Hezbollah flag.
Oh my!
I don't know if you can see that or not.
Yes, sir, we can.
Hezbollah flag on my wall that
Folks, our guest tonight, Fred Burton. His book is called Chasing Shadows, www.knifewriteshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. Fred, you just showed us a flag of Hezbollah. Can you tell us the story behind that and why that's on your wall?
Well, I acquired that flag through some means that I'd rather not get into at the time, but I have it up there to remind me of some of the cases that I worked over the years, in that Hezbollah is very much in the front pages today, and they have a long, storied history of killing Westerners and targeting Israelis and carrying out terrorist attacks. And before Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah clearly had more Western blood on their hands than any other terrorist group in the history of modern-day terrorism. So the organization is very much remains a threat not only to the United States and Canada, but also to the state of Israel. And they are a very sophisticated terrorist group that have the capabilities that in many ways far exceed an organization like Al-Qaeda.
Let's go there then, Fred. I'm going to do a little bit of an about face now. Folks, we're talking about terrorism, of course, with none better than an expert on counterterrorism, Fred Burton, our guest tonight. Fred, you mentioned Hezbollah, there's Hamas, and there's now the Muslim Brotherhood, all in charge right now in Egypt. When the Arab Spring came around, a lot of the folks that watched this show were elated, and I was very nervous. I was no fan of Mubarak, but at least there was some sense of continuity there, I guess you could say, or stability is a better word. Now the Muslim Brotherhood's in charge. We all know that Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm terrified for Israel. The reason being because the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't want Israel to exist, and now they're in charge of Egypt. And, on the north part, we've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Syria, of course. And I trace it all back to one singular state, and that state would be Iran. What are your views?
Well, certainly if you look at a center of gravity as the biggest threat to the national security of North America would be Iran. And after all the years of studying Iran as a nation, I don't think we've ever gotten it right. They've always been able to, from a diplomatic perspective, outmaneuver us. I can recall talking to the hostages that were held in our U.S. Embassy in 1979 as a young agent, and we're still dealing with the same issues today. And you mentioned something, Brent, that I'd like to key on that I don't think most people understand. When you had the Arab Spring unfold and you had countries like Egypt go under in many ways and go into an environment where you have the Muslim Brotherhood in charge, what happens is the intelligence organizations of Canada and the United States have an intelligence gap that develop because in a day-to-day course of intelligence liaison, you're going to have interactions with your counterparts like you and I are chatting today via Skype. And if you are too busy trying to handle your domestic unrest in a place like Egypt after you had the Mubarak fall, you have no time to visit with your CSIS counterparts, your CIA counterparts, your State Department agent counterparts. So you could go weeks without getting any intelligence that impact on your ability to protect Canadians on Canadian soil or Americans on American soil. And that's what most people don't recognize, that when you see these chaotic places in the world like Egypt and Libya, you lose a window of intelligence that impacts on our safety and security in our homeland. And you literally have to leverage other intelligence sources, such as the Israeli Mossad, who might also be losing windows of intelligence because they don't have those relationships or sources. So these kinds of events cause tremendous disruptions in the intelligence services. And don't let anybody fool you on that in the political realm or in the sound bites or in a politically charged election that we are dealing with here in the United States, that you have disruptions of intelligence information being shared to you because, in essence, the host government is more worried about domestic unrest than visiting with your UK or Canadian or American counterparts.
Is the threat, Fred, against Israel and by extension North America, the Western powers, if you will, is that a real threat?
Absolutely. There is no doubt about it. You can look at terrorism and the threat against Israel. It's something on a very tactical level, such as the killing of Colonel Joe Alon in 1973 in my book, and fast forward to 2012 today, and think of all the bodies that have happened between 73 and 2012, and think about the geopolitics of that. There is no doubt about the fact that the Iranians and their surrogates, such as the Hezbollah and your radical Palestinian factions, are targeting and attempting to kill Israelis on a daily basis. Right before we went on the air here, I was reading some intelligence reports we have here on just the rockets being launched into Gaza, and this is a day-to-day occurrence.
That's right.
Of radical Palestinians or foreign fighters in these areas that are trying to kill Jews, and they're not going to arrest until they do continue. So this threat is never going to abate.
Folks, and I just want to reiterate here, Israel apartheid, folks, fine. You're for human rights, and I'm all with you there. There's a distinctive difference, though. Hamas are the new Nazis. They don't want Jews anywhere in the world. Let's not be mistaken about that. In the same sense that Hitler and his Nazi thugs wanted to eradicate every Jewish person in the world, Hamas does, Hezbollah does, and so do the Muslim Brotherhood. So let's be clear about that. So how do you protect, how long do you think Canada would last if we started lobbing missiles? Right, I'm in Kingston right now, and let's say the CFB that's here starts lobbing missiles right across the border, which is 5 minutes away. In Syracuse. How long do you think Canada would last? I would give the United States, and justifiably so, about 2 minutes before a response would be coming. And yet Israel has to deal with this every day of their life. So that's the reality. So Israel apartheid, folks, read a different book perhaps and get a different perspective. Let's go back to Fred now. Let's talk about that threat against Israel. Do you fear that whatever comes about in Syria is for the worst or the betterment of the Syrian people?
Well, I think you can look at the events unfolding in Syria with just the Syrian government's brutal response on the killing of their own citizens. The figures of 30,000 plus have been bantered about on this end as not only a human rights tragedy, but just the brutality of the Syrian regime, which, let's not forget, is also very much Russian trained and equipped, and with a Russian mindset when it comes to their intelligence services. The Syrian intelligence service is very much KGB, Russian KGB, SVR, old school trained and mindset, and very brutal service. Very efficient and effective services from an intelligence perspective, but you can certainly look at the events unfolding in Syria and recognize that the outcome is not a good one. And you can look at the horrific events in Benghazi, Libya, as examples of chaos in these countries. And when you lose a host government protection aspect, meaning when you have social breakdown or a lack of public safety that could be afforded by the host government, that's when you have embassies overran. That's when you have U.S. ambassadors dragged out and murdered. And let's be clear, we're lumped in this together. Usually the threat is targeted against Israelis, Americans, Canadians, and Brits and Australians. So it's important that we maintain that close alliance collectively to keep each one of our countries safe.
Very much so. And folks, Fred had alluded to something I wanted to touch on as well. The KGB. Now, Black September, as you had told us at the beginning of the show, organized and carried out an attack during the 1972 Munich Olympics, where they took 11 Israelis and murdered them, essentially. Black September is a terrorist organization, and the Soviets, this is something I learned from Fred's book, folks, and you're going to learn a lot more. Chasing Shadows, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover, take you right to a spot you can order the book. They trained Black September. Now, talk about being a rogue citizen of the world, the Soviets. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, and we knew this before the fall of the wall, when the communism had the collapse of the Soviet Union, because we had very good intelligence through defectors and so forth, and we knew that the old Soviet regime was training groups like Black September and the Italian Red Brigades and the Red Army faction and the Japanese Red Army and the Baader-Meinhof group, but we didn't know to what extent. But you would subsequently learn that the Soviet KGB and the Cuban intelligence service and the Chinese were training a lot of these terrorist groups in the early 70s. And it presented problems for us in that what the Soviets were trying to do was destabilize the West with these terrorist organizations. And they fueled and funded and provided intelligence and weapons to groups like Black September that targeted the Israelis at Munich and other spectacular attacks. I mean, the brilliance of Black September in the 70s, of just spectacular terrorist attacks, long before Al-Qaeda surfaced, Black September was the first group to hijack 4 planes on one day. They really define terrorism, and Al-Qaeda has pretty much taken a lot of their training manuals and their design of some of their attacks based upon the Black September model. And just the sheer tempo, Brent, of Black September and their ability to strike all over the world was one that is still very fascinating to look at. And as you step back in that time period and you look at the persons that were involved, it's really just a fascinating time in the history of the world and the effect of terrorism and the use of state sponsors of terrorism, such as Russia and Syria and Iran. And this is why it's so important to dismantle state sponsors of terror like Iran, because they can use their embassies as platforms for intelligence collection. For example, they can use their diplomatic pouches that we can't open, the Canadian government can't open, the United States can't open, and send weapons, explosives, counterfeit documents, fraudulent identity documents. They can move these around unimpeded through their diplomatic pouches, for example. And that's why state sponsors of terror are so concerning to the governments of the world, simply because you have the entity and the organs of an intelligence government that can be used to fuel and finance operations.
You know, the other night during the debate, Mitt Romney said something that I agreed with. And he said the bear is not dead, meaning the Soviet Union. And I completely agree with that statement. Do you feel much the same way?
Yes, in many ways, if you look at the SVR today, which is the new modern version of the KGB, not much has changed. The organization is a very effective intelligence agency that has representatives all around the globe. They are an espionage threat, always will be. Fortunately, inside the United States and Canada, between CSIS, the FBI, the RCMP, and the CIA, there's a collective good job on keeping tabs on most of the Russians running around. But as you get into these third world countries or the breakaway Soviet republics, that's where it's really very challenging for Western corporations to operate. And then you look at Latin America and places like West Africa, where the Soviets and the Cubans and the Venezuelans and the Iranians and to a large measure the Chinese have a very active and aggressive intelligence service.
Very much so. Folks, our guest tonight's Fred Burton. Chasing Shadows is the name of the book. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Fred, we're going to have to start wrapping up, but I wanted to ask you one more question. My concern with Syria is everybody's saying go in and bomb and make a no-fly zone like we did in Libya. My concern with that is because there's a deep water port right inside for the Soviet Union, there I go again, for Russia. I see the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, how it could escalate very, very quickly to a nuclear standoff. I suspect that is part and parcel to the reason why we have not created a no-fly zone. Do you feel much the same way?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point. I think the problems and the challenges with Syria, and it was alluded to a little bit in the debate the other night, are the same challenges that we have in Libya, meaning there's so many different fractured groups, and in essence, it's like herding cats, trying to get them all under one form of umbrella that you could either focus or direct or agree with some targeting kind of criteria to either topple the Assad regime, much like what happened to Gaddafi. But that's easier said than done. And I hope we're not too late there, to be blunt. Time will tell. But it's very, very worrisome as you look at that area and just the geopolitics of Israel right in the midst. And it would not take much, Brent, to touch off or set off a series of dominoes that could lead us down a very, very bad path. Very much so. And it has always been a tinderbox. And I would think for the foreseeable future, until there's different Arab leadership that actually wants peace, I think it will stay a tinderbox. Absolutely. Fred, I want to thank you so much for your service once again. And regardless of what you said, you kept us safe. I am sure there are, as you mentioned before, dominoes. I'm sure there's many dominoes that you stopped from falling in your service to both countries, and I appreciate that. Thank you for keeping us safe all those years. And still. Thank you very much, Brent. You're very kind. Thank you, sir. The book is called Chasing Shadows, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest, Fred Burton's book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order this book from the comfort of your own home. Do yourself a favor, folks. Get the book. Thank you. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you all next time.
Listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy